Good morning. It's great to be back here at another IRAHSS conference. I think we are all very lucky to have Chris Schroeder visiting us here in Singapore. I think a lot of us are future thinkers, but he's clearly a future builder. And to be doing the hard work that he's doing in some of these difficult geographies and still be an optimistic person is a real testament to his spirit and to the potential that we have as humanity as we get more connected. Now, I also don't want to take for granted how lucky we are to have Peter Ho, who with ever greater eloquence each time lays out for us the conceptual changes and refinements that we should be thinking about as we try to tackle and decipher the future. So thank you, Peter. And to have the very elegant presentations that Kishore and Evelyn gave to us about some of the very big picture debates and the duality that is presented to us when we look at the geopolitical, the economic, and different regional landscapes. What I'm going to do today, in the short time before we get into the panel, is to take a multidisciplinary approach that's going to drill down on a couple of these and take a position maybe on some of the issues. Because, of course, and I think that Kishore did this very well, Evelyn also did it well, is to say that even though we come into conversations like this protecting or guarding our viewpoints by saying that the world is so filled with uncertainty and unpredictability, one can never be quite certain of anything. In Kishore's spirit, there are a number of things that we can actually be quite certain about, and I'm going to try and take a position on some of those, based not just on where we are, but because one can almost say that beyond a reasonable doubt, that's where things are going. Now, to start off on the multidisciplinary point, the first couple of slides I want to present will sort of get into this issue of how some of the cognitive blinders that Peter alluded to relate to the fact that so often we look at things just from one academic, conceptual sort of field or a viewpoint. The first is those who obviously focus primarily on the economic stresses in the system and may not necessarily appreciate other factors. Take an obvious example. You could look at Japanese or Eurozone debt to GDP ratio, and you could say this system is going to implode, the Eurozone must collapse. We're going into 10 years now of people saying that that Greece would have to exit the EU, but of course here we are 10 years later and it hasn't, because people who are only looking strictly at the numbers and the historical patterns associated with debt, for example, are not properly understanding the political dimensions of the European project and the commitment to it, or perhaps simply the lack of an alternative. Then there are those who look at things purely from an environmental standpoint, those who are looking only at technology, those who say, well, the robots are going to eventually take over and put us all in zoos, where not necessarily taking into account regulatory dynamics, ethical issues, political constraints, and so forth. And then, of course, there are the sort of geopolitical scholars or prognosticators who always see World War III under each and every rock. And we particularly saw those voices being very prominent in the year 2014, as if to, again, govern by historical analogy, and I'm just glad that Evelyn discounted this in her talk, as if 2014 just had to be the next 1914, because world wars are supposed to break out every 100 years, and well, it's been 100 years since World War I. So we had a raft of books in 2014 predicting World War III, but here we are, it's middle of 2017, haven't seen it happen yet. So, in that spirit, we have to obviously, at a minimum, take into account the economic, environmental, technological, geopolitical, social, many other kinds of drivers if we want to do a better job of understanding how this complexity is unfolding, how black elephants come to pass, and so forth. But I want to really focus my remarks in the deeper question about where we're headed with this question I have on the bottom. Are we or are we not getting better at pricing risk, at ring-fencing volatility, and mitigating long tails? So is our system evolving in such a direction that whatever black swans and black elephants and whatnot may arise, are we going to do a better job of dampening their impact? Because that, I think, is extremely consequential as well, especially since if we can't predict certain things, at least we should get better at managing the unpredictable. And that leads me into a point about what it is that I believe is a key driver of complexity in the first place, which is, of course, greater connectivity. If various geographical systems were not so connected to each other, you would not have the rapid feedback loops that create the kinds of volatility and unpredictability in our system. And it's something that we don't often appreciate because we don't often map it out. And that's been a feature of what I've been trying to do for the last couple of years, is to add a new layer of geography, functional geography it's called, onto our traditional maps of natural geography and political geography, which don't give us a sufficient understanding of the ways in which our units, whether we think of them as cities or states, actually interact with each other. But if we map and sort of lay out the ways in which and quantify the ways in which different units, social units, political units, are connected to each other, we can get a better sense of the strength or the weakness of ties and the potential feedback loops that occur across these spaces. So what I've tried to do here is to map out the physical infrastructures of the world. And when we speak about a connected global economy and ricochet effects in financial systems, a lot of that can actually be mapped out by looking at the ways in which our transportation, energy, and communications networks link to each other. Our global economy, again, and the flows of data, the flows of finance around the world rest on some kind of connectivity, some kind of infrastructure, some kind of linkages that we, again, very often fail to understand because we're not sufficiently cognizant of them. And what we don't see, what we don't visualize, what we don't map out, we tend to ignore. And so I think these maps of the world are very, very significant. Another is, getting back to the first slide, is looking at things from only one school of thought, one point of view. Again, the political, the economic, the environmental. And since we're focused a lot on the geopolitical trajectory, I wanted to think of this from a multi-century sort of evolutionary standpoint. Geopolitics is a 19th century, generally thought of it to be a European discipline that focused on the relationship between power and space, primarily territorial space, and you could more or less caricature, in a way, 19th century geopolitical thinking by bigger is better, if you will. In the late 20th century, along came this neologism. I do love neologisms. I've got a bunch coming up. Geoeconomics. We tend to attribute that to Edward Luttwak and other scholars who were looking at the ways in which trade balances, currency reserves, foreign investment patterns, and so forth shaped power dynamics between nations and empires and superpowers and so forth. Now, it's not new that economics is a major factor in geopolitics, but those working in geopolitics, for whatever reason, have gradually, in a way, focused less and less on that skill set, which was really a mistake, because of course you can't explain phenomenon like the rise of the United States itself without looking at industrial policy and trade balances. You can't explain the fall of the Ming Dynasty without looking at their balance of payments crisis arising from the lack of silver supply and imports that they had in the time. So economics has always been critical, but where has been the integrated vision? And then, of course, there's technology. And again, you can't explain the rise of the Mongol Empire 800 years ago without understanding the simple technology of the stirrup that you put your foot in when you're riding a horse, right? Or other geopolitical dynamics or the Ottoman Empire and other medieval empires without looking at the spread of gunpowder and munitions, right? So there's always been a critical technology factor. And of course, nuclear deterrence is the newest all-powerful, if you will, military technology, and now cyber tools and so forth. So my point here is that we still have people, or we have people in today's geopolitical conversation who either take a 19th century view or an economic perspective or now increasingly a technological perspective, but what about bringing all three together? And the leading scholars and strategists and people who publish in this field, particularly in the United States and elsewhere, are insufficiently fluent in what I would call languages. These are languages, right? Politics is a language. Technology is a language. Economics is a language. And what we all have to strive to do is to become more fluent in these languages if we want to do a better job of interpreting these dynamics and how they are unfolding. So let me look at an example that this builds on what Evelyn was saying about the Asia-Pacific theater. And one of the pillars of the U.S. grand strategy for the Asia-Pacific being not just the role of Pacific Command militarily, but also the Obama administration's desire to cement stronger trading relationships with countries on China's periphery through the TPP trade agreement. So what I put on the left there, by the way, is a rendition of the map of the world in George Orwell's novel 1984. There weren't actually, to my knowledge, maps in the book, so people have actually just tried to recreate what the geographic division of Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia would have been, roughly speaking, based on a reading of the novel. And that, to me, is sort of an oversimplified way of kind of the way that 19th century geopolitical view of the world. But if you want to bring in the geoeconomic more sufficiently, you would actually it would look something more like the Venn diagram on the right. Now, again, in traditional geopolitics, it's a zero-sum game. 1 mile gained in a conflict is 1 mile lost by your adversary. And that has tended to be the view in which people who, again, don't understand the relationship between technology, economics, and politics sufficiently have viewed the process by which the TPP would unfold. After all, part of the selling point to the US Congress, which ultimately failed, of course, was that this would be a way to isolate China. By building economic ties with China, with countries on China's periphery, you could start to marginalize China economically and create greater incentives for these countries to tilt back or ally strongly with the United States. And so it was viewed, again, in this sort of zero-sum kind of way, as if trade blocks are like geopolitical blocks, as if economic blocks are like territorial blocks. That's not the way economics works, ladies and gentlemen. That's not the way the world economy functions. It functions a lot more like this. And what you see, very importantly, is that on the right-hand side, where you have the TPP, or in one of the blue ovals, the countries that were TPP negotiating countries. And then on the left, you had the RCEP, which was of course an Asian-centric, some say a China-centric approach to liberalizing trade in the region. People forgot, by which I mean people in Washington who were pushing TPP, they forgot about all those countries in green. All those countries in the middle were simultaneously participating in the TPP negotiations, but also in the RCEP negotiations, because you can. Because that is the way the global economy functions. Because it cuts across geographies in ways, of course, that territorial geopolitical thinking does not allow. And so it should not have come as a surprise to people in Washington or in the West more generally, when with the failure of TPP, given that not only did Hillary Clinton not support it, Obama couldn't get support for it, and Donald Trump dumped it, but immediately afterwards, all of these countries in green not only moved forward with TPP negotiations without the US, but also now you have a fresh momentum around RCEP, because it was always there, and most of the same countries were participating in both sets of negotiations at the same time. And so you have to start to think of the world in even geopolitics itself, and the idea of power and space well beyond just territorial space into this idea of a global supply chain system and controlling or gaining maximum value or share of the profits in that system across geographies. And that's what I like to describe as the difference between war over territory and war over connectivity. And that seems initially like it's largely around economic transactions and not rooted in physical infrastructure, but in a moment I'm going to show you that war over connectivity and how it plays out in the physical infrastructural domain as well. But the fundamental point being that the global economy and global trade is additive, not substitutive. You cannot simply posit economic blocks as being sort of synchronous with territorial blocks. But now, a lot of people are also looking, those who do want to focus on the relationship between China's rising economic power and its geopolitical influence, are also missing something, because that too can be a bit too deterministic. So I purposely sort of designed this map so that it looks like some kind of Cold War era nefarious grand design of China to dominate the world by way of becoming the largest trading partner of more than twice as many countries as the United States is. And it's precisely to lend that impression. Again, it would be false to think that just because a country is the top trading partner of 124 countries, that it therefore has more leverage over them than other countries might. But again, because that's the way people think, I'm actually sort of perversely caricaturing that view here with this design. When you show this map in China, as I often do, including yesterday afternoon, what's so interesting is their reaction is a bit more of a sort of shock and horror. It's not, yay, we're winning. It's, oh no, look at all of these dyads of dependence. Because China, of course, does not want to depend on commodities imports 5,000, 10,000 kilometers from its shore on the other side of the Strait of Malacca in territories that it doesn't have any hegemonic relationship with, nor any significant military presence with, or really major political influence with. And trade relationships alone don't necessarily buy you those things. Evelyn did a very good job of pointing out some of the places where indeed, despite all of the economic investments China has made, you still have a political backlash against China. So they see dyads of leverage, right? Or not, they don't just see dyads of leverage, they see these dyads of dependence. But what they are trying to do, and this is case by case, you would have to look at each of these 124 lines, look at the relationships one at a time, to see where a particular historical pattern that is robust happens to be playing out in the case of China or not. And that is the fact that historically what can happen is trade relationships can become investment relationships can become military alliances. And that is actually quite a sort of, a well-documented historical pattern. So the question would be, where is China doing that and where is it not doing it? And there you would not be looking at trade data at all. You would be looking at investment data. You would be looking at China not as a trade partner of countries, but its net foreign investments into those countries. And that is a set of data that's not getting looked at nearly, well, it's getting looked at more and more when you look at port acquisition, technology, and so forth. And that's where we need to be turning our attention today, towards a much more complex view of the Chinese global economic role. Now let me get to the physical infrastructure and the economic infrastructure and linkages between countries and apply it to geopolitics and really, again, go back to that governing by analogy thinking where people have been saying, well, World War III is just around the corner. So what I've looked at is in the last 25 years, there have been 9 cases since the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, where people have said, well, this is World War III for sure, right? It's got to be Taiwan. I mean, anyone who was paying attention in the early 1990s, I see Barry smiling because you were probably in the Pentagon at that time, right? So in the 1990s, it was sort of, where's World War III going to break out? And of course, it was Taiwan, right? Ask 50 strategists, and all 50 would say it's Taiwan. Well, hasn't happened yet. Here we are, almost 3 decades on. And China and Japan, Iran, Russia more recently, US and China, of course, Thucydides trap, South China Sea, North and South Korea, China and India, India and Pakistan. Any of these regional or global dyads could have, at any point, escalated into a major regional or potentially even global conflict. Now, it hasn't happened yet. The burden of proof should fall on those who believe that World War III actually happened, should have happened in the last 25 years, but hasn't, to demonstrate at some point, with some predictive model that it's going to happen. And what they're missing, of course, is the other factors, that the extenuating circumstances, the mitigating factors, the degree to which in each of these situations you have very strong counter-incentives that relate to the connectivity between antagonists, and that becomes a very significant part of the decision-making calculus. But when you only govern by analogy and you say, well, trade was really high between Britain and Germany in the run-up to World War I, you're kind of forgetting all sorts of things around the distribution of global capital and currency reserves and supply chains, the fact that Britain didn't exactly produce, its industrial base was not located in Germany, whereas, of course, 2 of America's most valuable companies, Apple and Walmart, have so much of their supply chain based in China. This is not 1914, right? It's a very different kind of global economic system, and the strength and the depth and the breadth of those ties has a very, very significant impact in the way any 2 countries or pairs of regions in this in this look at each other. So the analogy I use to capture this is what I call tug of war. Tug of war is not new. It's actually the oldest organized human sport. We've been waging it in military training for 10,000 years. But what I've 10 million years. Wait, how many years? No, 10,000 years. But well, I'm sure there were some cavemen around doing tug of war back then as well. But what's so interesting about tug of war is in this sport, nobody gets killed, right? It's got the word war in it, but no one dies. And what's also interesting is that you are connected to your rival. And that's really the fundamental difference between today's system and previous systems, is the degree of connectivity between countries, either allies or antagonists. So we are competing with each other, but we're competing to gain maximum share or value of that rope, of that connectivity that ties us together. And if we were to view each of these conflicts, or any pair of countries, whether their relations are cooperative or conflictual, through the lens not just of here is their ancient ethnic hatred, here is their outstanding border dispute, therefore it is necessarily going to escalate. Kishore has done a very good job in recent years of pointing to the instances where commentators say China and India. Right now, there is some significant tension in the Sino-Indian border region, but that does not mean that World War III is going to break out. We see fighter jets, we see frigates, destroyers maneuvering over islands in the Sea of Japan as well. That does not mean that World War III is going to break out tomorrow, because you have to appreciate the extent to which there are other circumstances at play. If you don't look at the connectivity between these countries, if you don't look at their economic relations more deeply, you will not understand their decision-making calculus sufficiently. I'm going to have to jump ahead a little bit, but I wanted to show how the infrastructure dynamic plays out in the example of Eastern Europe, of the relationship between Russia and the West, because a lot of people look at the Ukraine conflict and have characterized Putin as nothing but a sort of Stalin redux and or refashioning himself as a 19th century czar bent on territorial imperial expansion. What you'd be missing if you only looked at the borderlines and not at the pipelines is that you would miss what's actually the sort of value-added objective in the Ukraine conflict. It's not really for Russia to take over the Donbass region, which is an economic wasteland full of elderly pensioners who are really a massive economic liability to the Russian state, much as Crimea itself is. It has a lot more to do with the value and the geography of oil and gas pipelines that flow underneath. But if you're not mapping functional geography, it's not Putin who's the 19th century sort of throwback, it's you. If all you look at is a political map and just see a land grab, you're literally not in the 21st century, because this has much more to do with the value of gas pipelines, which countries profit from the ownership structures of those pipelines, than it has to do with a few square kilometers of territory here and there, which are important, but this layer is equally, if not more important. And what's so fascinating about the geopolitics of infrastructure, and the second reason why I wanted to put up this map, is because Russia has on occasion tried to cut off flows of gas to Ukraine while also wanting to build more direct gas pipelines to Germany. Right? So undermine your weaker sort of rival that you want to punish, your former sort of Dominion Republic of Ukraine, but sell more gas directly to your largest customer in Europe. But interestingly, because if you map out the pipeline flows, what you'll see is that Germany actually is able to take Russian gas and sell it back through Poland to Ukraine from the west, rather than even if Ukraine gets cut off from the east. So Russia is the largest investor in building pipeline capacity between itself and Europe. And even though it tries to cut off Ukraine, it winds up selling gas and even being an investor and builder of the same pipelines that deliver its own gas back to Ukraine the other way. And what's so interesting in that is it shows that you can't necessarily control the infrastructure that you build that is not on your own territory. Why is this so significant? Well, let's bring it back to One Belt, One Road, right? Let's directly pick up on Evelyn's remarks. This is a map showing you all of the many completed or planned oil and gas pipelines, railways, even hydrological canals, and so forth. And you can put on top of this fiber optic internet cables and so forth, ports, airports, and so on, that are going to be built. So the string of pearls is on here. A lot of the projects that China has been negotiating bilaterally. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is here, and so forth. All of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, the AIIB projects, a lot of them are here. And to produce this, I've gone to Iran, to North Korea, to Turkmenistan, to all my favorite countries, and I've been asking them, what are your current infrastructure plans? What is it that you want China to finance? What are you going to raise multilateral capital for? And this is what you get. Now, because China knows that any number of these projects could fail, that there could be a backlash in Pakistan, in Myanmar, and elsewhere, but it desperately wants to escape this Malacca trap, it's going to invest in all of the above. And even though it's definitely not going to generate the kind of financial rate of return that they would like, because as anyone who knows their history should know, infrastructure never does. Infrastructure companies almost always go bankrupt, like the Pacific Railroads in the United States. But they're not doing it for a rate of return. Chinese grand strategy is not made by MBAs, right? It's made by people who are trying to escape the Malacca trap, who want to build the maximum number of transportation and trade corridors to connect themselves to resource inflows, including the Arctic, and outflows of goods. So I actually expect that no matter what political volatility and turbulence and backlash we will have, and I've spent a lot of time tracking this in Mongolia and Myanmar and Kazakhstan, countries that I call the ABC, anything but China. When countries realize that 80% of their foreign investment is coming from China and 80% of their exports are going to China, that's when they do what Myanmar did, as Evelyn pointed out. They say, can we please have an investor besides China? Will anyone please stand up? It tends to, by the way, not happen, which is why when you take a case like Sri Lanka, it turns out that no matter who's in power, they wind up having to reauthorize projects that they said that they were going to cancel. So I fully expect this map to be built. So let me just wrap up with a sort of certainty, right? The One Belt, One Road is, really the single biggest geopolitical sort of phenomenon of the early 21st century, and yet it's not about tanks and troops and nuclear warheads, right? It's actually about building infrastructure. And it was ever thus, right? The way in which great powers and empires project their influence historically is through Roman roads, through Ottoman railway, through the British railway, and now this, through One Belt, One Road. It is every bit as significant to map out connectivity and to assess and measure and project the geopolitical consequences of that infrastructure as it is to look at the military balance of power. So there was a lot more I was going to say, but okay, 30 more seconds, which is just that in the spirit of some of the sort of positive comments, optimistic comments, if you will, I do not set out to be an optimist. What I'm trying to show is that by building all of this connectivity for unilateral strategic purposes, right, each country, each power sets out to build the capacity, the connectivity to suit its own national interests and its own grand strategy. However, the sum total of that is lots and lots of usable connectivity that can serve multiple different purposes or be used by players that were not originally intended to benefit from it. So in a globally connected infrastructural system, you wind up having more and more pathways for the supply of goods, data, services to meet the demand for them. So if you just look at energy markets in the last few years, you realize right away how good a infrastructurally built out world, a connected world, can be for mitigating geopolitical volatility. Because really for a long time, access to energy, particularly oil and gas, and concerns over the choke points that could stop the flow of those commodities, such as the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, right here, the 3 dots on this map. That has been casus belli, right? If there is any blockage of resource flows through those choke points, that is a grounds for war. And you would expect then that when you have geopolitical turbulence, like potential conflict with Iran, Syria falling apart, Iraq falling apart, Libya, Russia invading Ukraine, you would expect oil prices to rise. But of course, that is not what has happened, right? In fact, oil prices are declining and continue to decline because what you have is an abundance of supply, but not just the supply itself, the connectivity of that supply to global markets. At this conference 5 years ago, if you said, what are some of the scenarios where China and the US might go to war, surely someone would have said it would be over oil and gas in the Middle East, or something like that. Instead, here we are today, and as of 1 year ago, the United States is shipping massive quantities of oil to China directly. As of 2016, December 2015, the United States Congress lifted the 40-year ban on the export of hydrocarbons, and immediately China became one of the largest customers. So instead of fighting a war with China over oil, the US and China are forming one of the tightest oil axes of trade in the world. And it shows how if you build connectivity, you will allow supply to meet demand, you allow certain market forces to play out, and those can have a very significant impact on reducing geopolitical volatility. They can also be dyads of conquest. They can also be ways in which cyber war are connected. But it's all about, are we ultimately, on balance, building a system that's more resilient? And on balance, I would argue, and I know that Aaron is going to grill me on this in a minute, but on balance, we build a world that winds up being more resilient, or even, as Nassim Taleb, to bring him up again, as Peter did, more anti-fragile. And what he meant was that an anti-fragile is more than just a synonym for resilient, right? It's a system that gets better and stronger and more robust over time. And in his book, Anti-Fragile, he actually cites human biology, evolution, and globalization itself as anti-fragile systems, because this connectivity creates more pathways for the system to continue to grow. My final point is, bringing it back to geopolitics, there are so many people who look at history itself as this cycle of conflict punctuated by progress and expansion. And that's what the lesson of World War I seems to teach all of us. That's the lesson we've taken away. It's completely the wrong lesson, completely wrong. Because, in fact, we have 60,000 years of human history, millennia of human history, that show that the one thing that we have been consistently doing is not fighting patterns of geopolitical great power conflict on a centennial basis. What it shows is that for 60,000 years, we've actually been building more and more and more connectivity to each other, between our countries, between our cities, between our societies, linking our economies with ever higher quality infrastructure. And that war and plagues and financial crises, to the extent that they occur, and occur regularly, they have not stopped that process at all. So it is not that history is a series of conflicts punctuated by periods of connectivity, but the conflict is more significant. It's that the actual march of history, the arc of history, if you will, is this continuation build-out of global connectivity. And sometimes it gets interrupted, sometimes it doesn't. But it is by far the most powerful force in human history. Thank you. And apologies for going on so long.